of her two men who were very close to her, that is her husband Clough and her brother John Strachey, who both attracted a huge amount of publicity and limelight, both during and after their lives. I think there are at least 2 or 3 biographies of John Strachey, who was Amabel's younger brother. What I'm going to say needs to be, I'm going to talk very much about the 20s and 30s. Let me, perhaps before I start going on about that, remind myself that I was brought up just a few hundred yards away in the village down the road, that of course I knew of Amabel, and I met her on various social events. My mother was quite close to her at one stage, worked here in the Plas during the time when the evacuees came, and there was a sort of link also with other people who worked here, who some of you will remember, like Laura McCafferty, who was very close to both Jean's family and mine. And all along I was, of course, conscious of Amabel's politics. One was aware that Amabel was, at that stage, I'm talking about the 50s and 60s of the last century, was close to the Labour Party, was supportive of the Labour Party in this part of the world, which of course had a Labour MP until 1974. And since my family shared many of those views, there was a kind of simpatico feeling towards her and Clough, let it be said, whose politics were not so different, as we will see. But I don't think I was aware of her active part in British left-wing politics in the 1920s and 30s until fairly recently. I certainly wasn't when I remember she asked me to read the draft of one of her endless books that she produced after the war, those compendiums, collections of stories, a lot about science, which was a passion of hers. And I read one, and she asked me to come up, and I had dinner with her and Clough here to see how a young person reacted to the book. I think she chose the wrong young person, because by then I was so bloody sanctimonious and extreme in my Marxist beliefs, so that the response was probably not what she had quite appreciated. But it is actually quite a good book. It's about Wallace, who's the other scientist who worked out about the origin of species. I don't think she quite realized how politically committed and extreme I was, even though quite clearly she had inhabited that world herself in the 1920s and 30s. And just say something very quickly about the 1920s and 30s. It was a time of extreme social and economic crisis following the First World War. At home, there was mass unemployment, particularly affecting Wales, I should say, not so much rural Wales, but urban Wales, or industrial Wales, perhaps I should say. Rates of 60, 70, 80% unemployed, male unemployment in the South Wales valleys. They were devastated, these areas. And there was this great economic and social crisis. And that led to protests, hunger marches. Even though there were Labour governments, the 1929 Labour government dissolved itself effectively in 1931 in the great crisis, when Ramsay MacDonald, one of the founders of the Labour Party, effectively jumped ship and joined the Conservative Party, or he led a Conservative government in the so-called national government after 1931, and the Labour Party was reduced to about 52, I think, MPs, a third of whom, by the way, who came from Wales, which since 1922, for 100 years now, has been a country that has voted Labour, which is quite an extraordinary political record. And it led to hunger marches, clashes with the police. It was a highly politicized, angry couple of decades, the 20s and 30s, particularly perhaps the 30s, when after the great crash in 1929, when the world was plunged into, if any of this has some echoes, by the way, reflecting the world we presently inhabit, that's just because it is the historical record, it's not intended to. Abroad, the big issue for those on the left was, of course, the rise of fascism, Mussolini's success in Italy in the early 1920s, and horrendously the success of Hitler, the rise of Hitler to power in 1933 in Germany, and the destruction of the German left, which was the biggest left-wing movement in Europe outside the Soviet Union, biggest communist party, biggest socialist party. Let's not forget that Marx and Engels were, of course, both German. They were effectively destroyed. I mean, they were effectively murdered by the Nazis during the 1930s. So this is a life and death matter, which astonishingly Amabel becomes involved in later on. And then there was Spain. And perhaps nothing grips the political imagination of the left more vividly than the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1938. When democracy in Spain was overrun by fascism, by Franco and his fascist troops. And that was, Amabel was, above all in this period, an anti-fascist. So I want to concentrate on this period. There's a message to say, and it is when I think she was most politically active, and she was very active in that period, as was her brother, John, it's fair to say, who was probably the leading Marxist intellectual in Britain in the certainly by the 1930s, crucial to the setting up of the left book club, which was so influential in promulgating left-wing ideas and socialist ideas in not just in Britain but throughout the world. The changes wrought by the Second World War created a very different scenario after the war. And there's a feeling, a sense that many of those activists from the 20s and 30s, of course, that many of them were getting older. Amabel herself had been in her 50s by then. You know, that this was a new world, a new Europe that was being created from the ashes of the war. And John Strachey, her brother, becomes, during the war, violently anti-communist, having been perhaps the leading pro-Soviet exponent of Marxism in Britain. He becomes violently opposed to them. Many communists went along that journey of great enthusiasm, and then either the Stalin-Hitler Pact of 1938 or the great trials of 1938, and I'll come back to the trials in a minute, or the invasion of Hungary in 1956, drove many of them out of the Communist Party. Very few stayed. One of them was Eric Hobsbawm, who lived in Park up the road. He was one of the few. Edward Thompson, who lived in Voti, left the Communist Party in 1956, even though he was probably their brightest intellectual star. I think it's also worth making especially today on the 11th day of the 11th month, it is worth marking the fact that Amabel also lost her son on active service in 1943, and that had a profound impact on her. And I can only, and if you go down to the War Memorial in Llanrothen, his name, Christopher's name, is the first name of those killed during the Second World War. He was killed in Italy. And in her autobiography, which I'm sure many of you will have read, she doesn't exactly skip over it, because what she writes is very moving, but I think we should just note that perhaps this was part of the change that happened following the war. Nobody should ask one to relive this, that is, the death of a son. No one should ask one to relive this. So let oblivion cover it for the reader, if never for the writer. There was a simple choice for myself, to be alive or dead. And that's, I think, Clough says something very similar, by the way, in his autobiography. They basically say, this was the most appalling thing that happened in their lives, but they don't want to talk about it, or they don't want to write about it. Now, Amabel was thought of herself primarily as a writer. And in her autobiography, she actually shows some resentment at the fact that in the post-war period, she becomes typecast as a writer for children. Before that, in the 20s and 30s, she writes novels for adults, and they are quite political. Now, she denies that her first one, Noah's Ark, by the way, they're very difficult to get hold of, these novels, and it's wonderful that there's this collection of her work here. The first novel, Noah's Ark, she says in her autobiography, is not a political novel. The others are, clearly. But it is about marriage, and I think, since the growth of feminism particularly from the 1970s, marriage can clearly be seen as part of the political structures in which we inhabit. And it's a very, very radical book. It's in many ways, I think it's her best book. Even though it's largely a discussion between her and her future husband, and her father-in-law, curiously, about marriage. And she, in her autobiography, again, she says that there was hardly anything political in Noah's Ark, and I would dispute that. I think it's very political, but in terms of what I suppose these days might be called sexual politics. There's a young couple, Edward, a very earnest young socialist journalist, and Frances, who's a young woman sculptor. Now, she comes from a very wealthy elite. He's not quite so, he's much more middle class. And basically, the book is around what kind of marriage should they have. It starts with, I'd like to just spend a little bit of time talking about these novels, because after all, that's what Amabel thought was important. At that time, she had 3 children by this stage, and she dedicated her life to writing these novels in the 1920s and 30s. The novel opens with an extraordinarily startling sentence. It says, "It was wonderful to get away from Edward, from his love, no less than from his undeviating public spirit." which is an astonishing sentence when you, Edward was the man she was going to marry, by the way. It was, so that's the first sentence, and I think that's as a literary, conceit, that's actually very effective. It was wonderful to get away from Edward, from his love, no less than from his undeviating public spirit. And basically the next 300 pages of the novel, she wrote very long novels, by the way, and not always with a very clear narrative line. So they're very discursive, there's endless discussion. So it's about what kind of marriage should it be? So Frances asks herself, why did people get married? Especially people to whom not marrying didn't mean celibacy. Okay, this is 1925, okay? Now by 1965 or 75 or 85, maybe that wasn't such a big issue. But in 1925, to see so matter-of-factly saying, getting married is not a problem, you don't have to be celibate, you can still have sex. That was quite a radical position for a married woman with 3 children to hold. Now then they talk, well, if they're going to get married, what kind of marriage? But first of all, she says, why get married at all? Because we can, we can just have sex, or we can just have an affair. And this comes up all the time. Why can't they, and I'm quoting now from the novel, celibacy is ridiculous. Could the lovers not, quote, live together, or, quote, go away together often? I love that, often. And then she discusses with Edward's father, with the curious name of Martineau, must you marry me, Frances asked. Couldn't it be an affair? For most marriages are a tragedy. Now, this is really quite radical stuff, and we haven't come to the party political stuff yet. This is a woman clearly, thinking about the fundamentals of how you live your life. She was afraid that she might not remain faithful to her husband. If we marry and I'm not always faithful or kind, I dread that, says Frances. Later, she spends much time discussing these matters with Edward's father, Martineau, as I said, especially how to protect Edward if she were to have lovers. I want to protect him from all the things in me that are dangerous, she says, especially as she wants, quote, adventure, not just sex, but of course that comes in. Earlier, she fears that she might so easily be a viper to him, and she reflects bitterly and tellingly that, quote, because you were a woman, it was so clearly and bleakly your responsibility. So that you can see where this is going. This is a woman feeling that she has to make decisions because you're a woman, these are the decisions you have to make, especially as she points out that you can choose whether or not to have children by that stage. And she's not talking about abstinence there, she's talking about contraception. In the end, and it's an extraordinary last chapter, she has a baby and everything is resolved. So many novels have a cop-out ending. And even though the last chapter is beautifully written, it's a cop-out ending and she must have known it. But then, read anybody. Elizabeth Gaskell wrote so many novels with cop-out endings. You don't know what to do with a hero and heroine, so you send them to Canada or whatever. It's the same thing here, really. They have a baby and everything's fine. And I think she was aware of that. But, there is an astonishing piece of writing in Noah's Ark. Some of what she's saying reminds me so much of feminist writing in the late 20th century, 40 or so years ago. Her home, she comments of Frances, This is Amabel writing now about, this is the author writing about Frances. Her home had turned all in a moment into a prison, and it showed that you might come to hate it too, as so many women did. Was it all sex, really? Elsewhere, she asked, did all women feel like this, caught with obligations, feeling that you had given someone else a perfect right to change your mood, your house a cage? Now, that is straight out of feminist literature of the 1970s. She expresses it very well. She takes it, the whole thing, to a different level in what is frankly a bizarre, but I think fascinating. I leave it with you, I'm not quite sure how to interpret it. Passage. She is visiting some of her very wealthy friends, and on the way there, she passes through the home farm. You know, every big estate had a home farm that produced food for the big house. And intriguingly, the farm is called Venusberg, which is curious. And then she goes on to say, puzzlingly, I think, the whole thing, that is the farm and everything that was going on there, the production of food, agriculture, the estate itself, the whole thing was made possible only by obedience to the phallic law. Was everything, she asks, subject to this phallic oppression? Now, in 1925, that is a very radical, I think, interpretation of power relations between men and women, and it's stated in a very in that very dramatic way. I've never known of anybody else write about the phallic law and about phallic oppression, maybe, but I've never seen any reference to the phallic. So that was Amabel in her first novel, you know, challenging a lot of perceived opinion about lots of things. Later, it has to be said, she wrote more comforting, still very progressive, but more comforting sort of homilies to marriage and parenthood. But in Noah's Ark, I think she raises some profound issues in a very courageous and open way, and an open and radical approach to what we've subsequently come to think of as sexual politics. Her next novel, The Wall of Glass, in 1927, there's a reference in the book itself to a wall of glass between their minds. And I think that refers, if I remember correctly, actually to the wall of glass between left-wing intellectuals like herself and the working class. But equally, it can be interpreted as the wall of glass between radicals and the privileged. And it is much more political in the sense that it contains a lot of political analysis, lots of real life figures. The leader of the Independent Labour Party, Jimmy Maxton, is a very well created character, very well portrayed character in the novel. Oswald Mosley, who was then a Labour MP in 1927, later, of course, to establish the British Union of Fascists in 1932. He's a big player in the novel, as is her brother, John Strachey. In her autobiography, by the way, she does state that Oswald Mosley had made romantic advances to her, which is perhaps not surprising when you know about Oswald Mosley. But, yeah, Yeah. There's a wonderful description. If you're interested in left-wing politics in the 1920s, and then it's got a wonderful few pages describing the ILP summer school, which was the place to go if you were a socialist intellectual, and a lot of working class intellectuals as well went to the ILP summer school, and they would have endless lectures and what have you. And she's gently mocking of it, though she feels very strongly that some of the working class people there, some of the workers there, women in particular, are traveling a very hard road, while it's much easier for the intellectuals. She mocks some of the intellectuals. She makes a reference, some of you might know of David Thomas, who was the leading ILP activist in North Wales in this period. David Thomas is there in the novel, only briefly, but he clearly emerges in there. So it's basically a novel about, the second half of the book, by the way, is largely an account, as I say, narrative delivery is not something you find in Amabel's books. There's no great story there. They're not page turners. But the second part of the book is largely about an electoral campaign that her brother stood twice in Birmingham as a Labour MP, as a Labour candidate. Lost. He was finally elected in 1929, and it's very, very detailed account of a parliamentary campaign. It also shows, I think, finally shows at the end some disillusion, and I come back to this point perhaps later, with the Labour Party. She clearly felt, and she states this in her autobiography, she clearly felt that by the 1929 Labour government was clearly incapable of solving the unemployment problem. People were starving, and the Labour government didn't seem to be able to do anything about it. And she says that those of us in what she calls the progressive parties, and as we'll see, that can mean either the Independent Labour Party, which left the Labour Party, by the way, in 1932, because they thought the Labour Party was doomed to reformism, and the Communist Party, which increasingly comes to be part of the Amabel story. So she's quite clear, and the novel reflects this a bit. She thinks the Labour Party is woolly, that it has no real policy. Again, if there are any echoes to the present, they're purely accidental. And that that these people are not sufficiently ruthless, unlike, as we'll see in a moment, like the conservatives that she knew. The third novel which I read, there are two other novels which I haven't been able to get hold of, but the third is a huge book called The Big Firm. And this is, again, not an explicitly political novel, but there's a huge amount of politics in it. And there's actually more of a story. Much of it is about an attempt by the Big Firm, by the way, is a big capitalist concern that's been making money for years and years out of people. And a young Welsh scientist goes to them, and this is the first time there's a Welsh element to all of this. This is the late 30s now. And he goes to work for them, but he becomes disillusioned because his research is not being used for humanitarian reasons. So it's a very good story. But the action comes from an attempt to picket, to prevent a ship from leaving the docks in London with a cargo of arms for the rebels in Spain, for the fascist army in Spain. And it's quite complex and fast moving, but it's about direct action. Basically, people using the power of the left, such as it was, to prevent the shipment of arms to Franco's armies, and it's quite effective in that regard. But it is much more clearly an anti-capitalist novel than some of the others. So all these three novels demonstrate a thorough knowledge of the left. There are long depictions of Labour Party policy, of the stance of the Communist Party, of left-wing parties and individuals like Jimmy Maxton, I mentioned, of the ILP, of the minority movement. You know, she goes on and on about the minority movement, actually, which most people have never heard of, I'm sure. The minority movement was an attempt by the Communist Party to create rank and file trade unions, that is, trade unions that weren't run by trade union leaders, that were run by shop stewards, something the left has been trying to do ever since, actually. The revolution left with very little success, or relatively little success. She goes, but she's enamored of the minority movement, which comes out in the end. It's the minority movement that prevents the Bolsheviks, of course, were a minority. You know, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks were the majority, and they all got killed. The Bolsheviks were the minority, and of course they all got killed by Stalin. But that's again, so I'm jumping here. But so she writes a great deal about the left, but it's equally true that she displays a really expert knowledge, a real profound knowledge on those on the other side of the glass wall, on conservatives and liberals, those whom she memorably described, and I think it is a wonderful description. She describes as belonging by heredity to the trade of ruling. This is what these people do, they rule. This, after all, was the class from which she came, the class she knew intimately, and to which she considered herself to be a traitor. So it's a quite extraordinary, class traitor was a phrase used on the left to describe very often trade union leaders who backed down from the struggle and supported the capitalist enemy. You know, so the left, this historiography of the left is full of traitors. Ramsay MacDonald being the great, foremost example. So there are lots of class traitors, but it's very unusual to find it used the other way around. That is, a member of the ruling class, effectively, which is what Amabel was, from the aristocracy of the intelligentsia, of the conservative intelligentsia in Britain, the father, owner of the Spectator, that she goes over to the other side. She goes over to the left, and she calls herself a class traitor in her autobiography with some pride, I think. But she knew the other side. And this perhaps is where her political influence might have been greater than one might have thought, that she clearly was able to communicate with, and she was trying to communicate with conservatives and liberals to try and show them the error of their ways, or what should be done in the anti-fascist struggle. She knew them especially around country house parties. All of these novels have wonderful, they're just like Henry James, they're wonderful descriptions of country house parties with all the butlers and, the private tennis courts and private golf courses and all the rest of it. What in one of the novels she calls these parties as events where philandering was mixed with ideas, which is an interesting way of looking at it. But she knew about all of this. And in the glass wall, there's a fascinating discussion about, in a sense, whether she should know about all of this. whether she should write about, these country house parties and the ruthlessness of the ruling class and its ability to reign. Excuse me a minute. And this is to do with the presumed sort of asceticism of the left. That there was a kind of, I'm not quite sure from my own experience where this comes from, but it's there in all the literature, this idea that the left was somehow anti-pleasure, that the left was Puritan. I think it goes back to the Civil War, basically. It goes back to the idea that the radicals, are all, they're roundheads. They hate you having a good time, whereas the Cavaliers love having a good time. So you can go off to country house parties and philander and have intellectual debates. Whereas if you go to the ILP summer school, you're going to have earnest, stuff about tables and graphs and people talking about bloody unemployment and stuff like that. And she rejects this absolutely, and she goes at it head on, really, by saying, why do people assume that we ought to be ascetics? As to one of the characters in The Glass Wall. What's wrong with Labour MPs and trade union leaders drinking champagne? Amabel was not an ascetic, as I think we all know. It was clear that left-wing activism did not preclude parties and champagne. And she's very adamant about this, by the way, and she confronts it in her autobiography as well. Why shouldn't left-wing people have a good time? Why shouldn't we go to parties? We're not Puritans. And it's quite challenging because you feel that underneath this, there is this sense that there's something not quite right about someone like Amabel having such left-wing views and yet living what is clearly quite a privileged life, both here in the Plas, but also in, by the time they moved to Romney House in Hampstead, which if you know Hampstead at all, must be one of the most sought after properties in London. Absolutely beautiful house in a wonderful, wonderful location. And that's where they lived much of the time. And she was aware of the criticism that could be made of her, of double standards. And she tackles it head on, both in the novels and in her autobiography, and just rejects it. Perhaps not entirely, but she makes a very good case for drinking champagne and going to parties. Now, the left was confused and confusing in all of this. The other left-wing figure, of course, who was characterized as the Bollinger Bolshevik, was none other than Nehru Bevan, who Amabel knew well. She complains in her autobiography that he couldn't get up in the morning. And Bevan was famous for his visits to the Café Royal in London, and where he would have the best food and the best wine. And he found no problem with this, and that he lived in considerable comfort. Lived on his Surrey farm in very considerable comfort. He only visited Tredegar, by the way, once a month, when he booted his sister out of her bedroom so that he genuinely could stay there. And then, it's not the best record when it comes to proletarian solidarity. The Communist Party could be very Puritan indeed, and Amabel became editor of this magazine in 1934, or one of the editors, Left Review. I'd send it round for you to look at. She's got an article in this, by the way. It's called Black History, it's not about the Black history we're working against today, it's about coal miners and how they need to rebel. That's February 1936. Another co-editor was Tom Wintringham, quite famous communist who fought in Spain. He was, in fact, briefly sort of expelled from the Communist Party because of his admittedly chaotic personal life. But Amabel clearly rejected all of that kind of criticism. She opposed these strictures. She enjoyed parties, and she discusses that openly. Eric Hobsbawm, who lived in Pack across for a while, or off and on, got to know Amabel during that period. Amabel used to go up and she used to drive up to talk to Eric and his wife. And Eric, in his autobiography, says she enjoyed the sweetness of life, the new emancipation of women. And clearly she did. But having said all that, her dedication to the cause was never in doubt. She was an activist. One historian writing about anti-fascism in the 1930s noted that Amabel was the General Secretary of the British section, which is, by the way, a very communist formulation. The British section of that or the other is the way communists used to talk. Of the IAWDC, the International Association of Writers for the Defense of Culture, which was an anti-fascist European group, trans-European group. As such, she was, he claims, an omnipresent and untiring anti-fascist activist in the 1930s. And the success of the 1936 London Conference, which is a conference for the whole of Europe not already under fascist control, owed much to the organizing work of Mrs. Amabel Williams-Ellis. A famous writer who was sympathetic to the cause, but got a bit fed up with all of this politicking, and with Amabel, one feels, was none other than Virginia Woolf, possibly one of the most important writers of the 20th century. She had gone to one of Amabel's parties in Romney House and had there met André Malraux, the French novelist and communist. And Malraux had persuaded her to support the anti-fascist cause and to support this conference that Amabel was organizing. She found Virginia Woolf a wonderful writer, but she found it difficult to cope with lots of aspects of life around her. She found this new world she'd been suddenly catapulted into, all this politic. She found it quite impossible. And I recently read this article, by the way, in Woolf Studies. I never knew there was a journal called Woolf Studies, but there is. And there's a whole journal dedicated to Virginia Woolf. She found the activism, the political activism, which was so familiar to Amabel, impossible to bear. London, she wrote in her diary, became intolerable. What with Serge Bernal, a friend of Amabel's, by the way, a famous scientist, Amabel, she mentions Amabel by her first name, Amabel, Miss Gardner and Mr. Kidd, I don't know who they were. Telephones hourly, peremptory demands to meet, to sign, to discuss, finally an abortive conference. When she retreated from the fray, that is Virginia Woolf, she had to face the unwillingness of the redoubtable Amabel Williams-Ellis to accept that Woolf had withdrawn. So Amabel was still badgering her. And she complained, and I quote, a woman called Ellis Williams, she got the names wrong, a woman called Ellis Williams ran amok. Gide and other famous French abused me. I think that's a wonderful image to have if you know anything about Virginia Woolf and the interwar, and Gide even, you know, the idea that Amabel was running amok and André Gide was abusing her. Now, I stayed a bit with that episode, and that's not that important really in itself, but it just shows that, ascetic or not, and she was not, Amabel was an activist. And she was still secretary of the British section in 1937. So it's worth perhaps reminding ourselves that born in 1894, she was in her 40s by this stage. And of course, the IAWDC was not the only organization in which she was active. She was also a member of the council, along with virtually every prominent writer in Britain. She was a member of the Council of the National Council for Civil Liberties, the NCCL, I think it's called Liberty now, is it? Yeah. Which was founded in 1934 to protect the civil rights of hunger marchers because they were being arrested wholesale by the police. And this council to protect their civil rights was established, and she was very much part of that. She was also an editor, as I said earlier, of Left Review, and also active in the Society for Cultural Relations with the Soviet Union. And this is where it gets interesting. This fact, along with her visits to Russia, suggests a very close relationship with the Communist Party. For in truth, it was not possible to operate in some at least of these organizations without Communist Party assent. That's the way the party worked. For these, the Left Review, to some extent NCCL, certainly the minority movement, certainly the National Unemployed Workers Movement, were so-called front organizations. That is, they were apparently independent, but in truth were controlled by the Communist Party and in turn by Moscow. And whether Amabel was ever actually a member of the Communist Party is a moot point. My own feeling is that she wasn't, that she always remained a member of the ILP. Though sometimes the ILP, by the way, which George Orwell was also a member of, could be far to the left of the Communist Party, as they were in Spain. If you read Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, it is all about how the Communist Party, how the communists in Spain betray the revolution. The security services believed she was, and I quote from her file, which is here, part of her file, security file, okay? God knows what mine looks like. But she had a very big security file. And they believed she was, I quote, active on the left in support of anti-war activity and the Society for Cultural Relations with the USSR, an organization with communist connections. There is no specific evidence that she was a member of the Communist Party, and they would have known. A number of historians have assumed that she was, given her activity in these front organizations. What would appear to be without question, it seems to me, is that she would never have become an editor of Left Review and attended the Soviet Writers' Conference in Moscow in 1934 without party approval, or indeed without following the party's direction. Now, Eric Hobsbawm, who I mentioned earlier, was a party member for much of his life, Communist Party member, even effectively when the Communist Party ceased to exist, or effectively ceased to exist. So he knew a thing or two about being a member of the Communist Party. And in his autobiography, he claimed that Amabel had, and I quote, joined the Communist Party unofficially. I don't know what on earth that means. There is no such thing as being a member of the Communist Party unofficially. And Eric must have known that. I think what he meant was that she was very close to the Communist Party without actually being a member. He goes on to say, she remained a little homesick for the days when the party was a semi-conspiratorial, embattled band of brothers and sisters. She welcomed me to Parc as a reminder of those times, someone with whom she could gossip about the comrades. And she does from time to time make some jokes about the comrades. In the wonderful little satirical book that she wrote with Clough, headlong down the years, published in, I think, 1951. She has a character who comes in who's called Commis Force. She's a woman, Commis Force. Commiform was, of course, the International Communist Organization. She also, in her autobiography, makes a rather unfair joke about Arthur Horner, leader of the Welsh miners and a prominent communist, saying that even if you had asked Arthur whether it was a nice day or not, he'd have to ring Moscow first to find out the answer. It's a bit unfair because Arthur Horner actually did stand up to Moscow on a number of occasions, and no doubt had he lived in Moscow, he would have been eliminated. But she was aware of these things, and she could joke about it. So, member or unofficial member, or neither, Amabel's activism during the interwar years attracted the attention of the security services, as I mentioned. She is well known to us, confirmed Kell, the man who established the British security service, the first director. He wrote in 1936, she is well known to us. And indeed she was. They had her under surveillance since 1927 and were to continue reporting on her activities until well into the Second World War. In part, this would have been because of her close links with the Soviet Union and with leading figures in the Soviet government. Now, she first visited Russia, ironically, to the Donbass, now part of the contested area in Ukraine, in 1928 with her brother, John Strachey, who was by then editor of the Miner, the Miners' Federation newspaper. She was very anxious to visit because, as she later recalled, to many of us, the Russian effort seemed important. Might it not truly be, quote, the fatherland of the workers? Now, what's interesting about her, I think this is going to happen now. Oh no, here it is. What's interesting about her visits to Russia is that when she's coming back in 1928, she falls ill and she stops in Moscow. Remember, this is only a few years after the revolution. These are very traumatic times. She stops in Moscow and she stays with an old friend from Hampstead, Ivy Litvinov. Now, what's interesting about Ivy is that she was married to a very important man in the Soviet regime, Maxim Litvinov, who was at the time in 1928 was Deputy Commissar for Foreign Affairs. By 1930, Stalin had made him the Commissar, the People's Commissar of Foreign Affairs. He was running the Soviet Union's foreign policy, and Amabel was staying with them, as indeed did Clough later on. Now, Litvinov being Jewish, was removed in 1938 because he was not obviously happy to go along with the Hitler-Stalin pact, but he was sent to a possibly an even more critical job. He became the Soviet ambassador to the United States, which of course in the Second World War was an absolutely critical position. So the Soviets must have thought that Amabel was an interesting person to know. Otherwise, they would, no way, 1928, would they have allowed her to stay with one of the key political actors in the Soviet regime. And the second time she visited Russia, she went with Clough. The story is fairly well known. Clough went to look at all sorts of building projects and planning projects in the Soviet Union. He was offered, according to his autobiography, a contract to build a new town in Russia. And even though the pay was very generous, it was in rubles, and you couldn't transfer rubles to sterling. So that was the end of that. He also stayed with the Litvinovs, and then in 1934, Amabel goes off again to Russia to attend the International Writers' Conference opened by Maxim Gorky. And by then she had nailed her colors firmly to the policy of the United Front, of the alliance of socialists and communists. So you could see that she could perhaps be very useful. She had huge contacts in the literary and intellectual world in Europe, not just in Britain, but across Europe. She also knew many of the key political actors in Britain, be they on the left or on the right. She knew a lot of conservatives. She went to their parties. You could see why she would be a person of interest to both the security services and to the Soviet Foreign Service. And as we'll see, she kept in close touch with the Russian embassy. What time is it, by the way? Sorry, I have to go on.
2 minute review it. 2 minute review it.
Oh, okay, so I'll try and bring it all to it. I mean, basically the whole history of socialists and communists in the 1920s and 30s is hard to fathom. But just to remind you that the Communist Party was very small in Britain, was still relatively important in France, where it was to become very important. It was significant in Spain and significant in Italy as in opposition to Mussolini. But basically the heart of communism in Europe was Germany. And the Soviet foreign policy suddenly decided from the beginning, from the establishment of communist parties, they had tried to affiliate to the much bigger socialist parties. That's what happened in Britain. The Communist Party, time after time, tried to affiliate to the Labour Party. The Labour Party refused to have them. And that's what happened in other countries as well. Then suddenly, Moscow changed the line. Suddenly, these were not socialist parties. They were social fascist parties. And it was your job to undermine them in any way you could. So you don't suddenly affiliate to them. You do whatever you can to weaken them. And that policy was fatal in the context of Germany, because it meant that the left was totally divided when it came both to the battles on the streets against the Nazis, but also when it came to any kind of political alliance to stop Hitler coming to power. As a result, of course, as I said earlier, as a result, Hitler succeeded both on the streets and in the end on the ballot box. I always used to remind my students that Hitler was elected, it wasn't a coup. Democracies can produce strange creatures. Amabel was very conscious of these developments, and for her, and quoting her now, the crucial value judgment was whether or how far it would be possible to make a united front with the communists. I was one of those who found it possible and necessary to work with the communists. The failure of the German left to unite was to me a terrible precedent. And she was, of course, right. The Comintern line, the Communist International line, changed again in 1935, so that now suddenly it was all right to ally with anybody as long as they were anti-fascist. So you could ally with liberals and conservatives as long as they were anti-fascist liberals and conservatives. So from going from a position of calling socialists social fascists, suddenly everybody on the political spectrum becomes an ally. Amabel, though, was clearly much more committed to the idea of the united front, as opposed to the popular front, the united front being the alliance of socialists and communists. That's where her heart belonged in the 20s and 30s, and that's what she tried to build, along with people, by the way, like Canary Bevan, who believed in all of that. And interestingly enough, she addressed the meeting in Tonopandi of communist-led miners in 1932 to argue for that position. Just to finish off very quickly, because I think this is an extraordinary story. She talks about it in her autobiography, but she really doesn't give it sufficient prominence. Because in 1934, the year after the Nazis take over, she goes to Berlin, apparently at the instigation of a film director, Ivor Montagu, who was a prominent member of the Communist Party. The purpose of her visit was to highlight the plight of communists who'd been arrested following the Reichstag fire in 1933. In particular, a Bulgarian communist called Georgy Dimitrov. Now, in her autobiography, she says she hadn't realized that Dimitrov was such a big fish. In fact, he was a very big fish because he was released from prison. He goes back to Moscow. Stalin makes him president of the Comintern. He runs the World International Communist Movement. And following the Second World War, he becomes president, the first communist president of Bulgaria. This is a very, very big fish in the communist movement. And Amabel goes to Berlin to get him freed from prison. And she gives an account of how she manages to do that. She then returned to Germany, and I think this is even more astonishing. She returns to Germany later in the same year, 1934, to try and assist the leader of the German Communist Party, Ernst Thälmann, and a pacifist journalist called Karl von Ossietzky. They were both imprisoned by Hitler. This obviously met with no success. They weren't going to let the leader of the German Communist Party go free. Ossietzky died of tuberculosis at the age of 48 after 5 years of mistreatment in a concentration camp. Ernst Thälmann was shot on Hitler's orders as late as 1944, the personal orders of the Führer, after suffering 11 years of torture and solitary confinement. Amabel had been in Berlin to try and free these men through her contacts, through the influence she had posing as a journalist. And Ossietzky's daughter came and stayed here to convalesce after all of this trauma. So she is involved, you know, as a phenomenon. This isn't just someone who goes and addresses meetings. This is someone who goes into the heart of the dictatorship and actually tries to get people freed. It shows astonishing courage and determination. Yeah, I'll draw it to an end really now, but I just think it's worth making those points that, as I said earlier, she becomes editor of Left Review, or one of the editors of Left Review. In 1934, she writes about the workers, the Writers' Congress in Moscow. She is criticized by some for not sufficiently praising, proletarian writing. This is the time of a kind of cultural revolution where you've got to write about the proletariat, and on the whole, she didn't. That's not the world she knew. She wrote about the world she knew, which was intellectuals and the wealthy, basically. Though she also includes, as I know, as I said earlier, a lot of. She writes very little about working class experience, so she's very different from communist writers like Lewis Jones from the Rhondda, who wrote a couple of very proletarian novels in the 1930s. She was criticized by some readers of Left Review, and she responded to that in a very interesting way by setting up a writers' competition, which she encouraged workers throughout Britain to write about their own experiences, and she then published what they'd written, which I think is, astonishingly enlightening and an interesting approach. And she worked assiduously to edit what these people had written and to prepare it for publication. I haven't been able to read much of it, but here she was demonstrating that she was committed to working class culture, and it just makes one wonder about how in 20 years she had travelled from being the daughter of the owner of the Spectator, from briefly being the literary editor of the Spectator, which, as you know, is still a right-wing magazine, characterized by very fine writing, by the way, and how the road she had traveled, which has taken her from that point to all the way to trying to save people from Hitler and supporting arms for the Republicans in Spain. So I have no doubt. I mean, the only world she knew was the world of intellectuals and creative people, and she put her shoulder to the wheel in an extraordinary manner, living most of the time in that period in Hampstead, but also spending a lot of time here. And I think it is interesting that by 1938, the hero of one of her novels is a Welsh scientist. So I wish, when I came up to have that dinner with her and Clough, that I'd known a little bit more about all of this. I might have treated her with a little bit more respect and awe had I been aware of that. There's just one little story I could end with, because it's very mysterious. In the security file, just before the Spanish Civil War starts in early 1936, Clough and her go to Gibraltar on a cruise liner. I'm not sure what they were called then. And the Secret Service in Britain tell the people in Gibraltar, the authorities in Gibraltar, these two very left-wing people, very active, are coming to Gibraltar, keep tabs on them. And so they arrived, and they did indeed keep tabs on them, and then they disappeared. The police lost them for a whole day. And they said on their embarkation form that they were going to see Sir George Baker in Torremolinos, is that the name of the place? Yeah, down the coast. Whether they did or not, we don't know, but because the police lost them. But if they did, that in itself is interesting, because when the Civil War started a few months later, Baker established an ambulance unit to go into battle with the Republican soldiers against the fascists. So he was a very active anti-fascist English aristocrat living in Spain. And he, so what they were up to, goodness knows, because the very next day, they then come back to Gibraltar, and the very next day they get a ship back to Southampton. And neither of them mention anything about it in their autobiographies. So it's as if they'd never been to Gibraltar. By the way, interestingly enough, if you read Amabel's file, Amabel was clearly the one they were concerned about because of her close relations with Russia. They're just as interested in Clough, because Clough's politics were also in the Isle. You know, he joined the ILP. Having been an officer in the First World War, he came out of that war as a convinced pacifist, and was very active on the left in himself in the 20s and 30s. And of course, a lot of his works on planning and housing are informed by that vision. So he's not excluded by Amabel here, but I do think Amabel deserves more than the occasional mention that she gets. She was, I think I mentioned to Richard long ago that Plas Brondanw deserves a footnote in the history of British socialism. I think it probably deserves more than a footnote. Diolch yn fawr.
I think I always knew Amabel was a great socialist, but I didn't really realise how influential she was.
No.
And I guess there has been a small resurgence of academic interest.
Yes, there has.
Recently, we've had a few people contact us from
Yeah.
universities who are doing PhDs about various aspects.
Yeah.
But I think it's obvious that there's a lot more there, isn't there?
Yeah. Oh, I agree. I mean, you know, obviously, I had meant to say there's actually the number of historians have looked at her in the context primarily of women writers.
Yeah.
And she is, as I hope I succeeded in showing earlier, you know, she was a very interesting woman writer. But there's far more to her than that. And she was very much part of.
It's a shame that her books are so hard to get.
Yeah, I know. Well, the one of them, I think it's The Wall of Glass. I only managed, I haven't brought it with me because it's almost falling apart. I found it in New Zealand. Rachel will be interested in knowing. And it is in very poor condition because it had been because it came from the library of H.G. Wells. And after H.G. Wells died, his daughter moved to New Zealand and his library was in transit to New Zealand when the war broke out. And so they sat for the whole of the Second World War on the dock in Singapore, while the Japanese presumably wondering what on earth this stuff was. And then it eventually made its way to New Zealand. And it's inscribed by Amabel. She's written inside it to H.G. Wells, who she knew quite well. But you know, it took a lot of postage stamps to get it from New Zealand to Pentreveli.
We've got copies of some of them, but
Yeah.
only one, or you know, we don't have multiples. And
There's the autobiography.
some of them, the autobiography you can get.
Yeah, the autobiography
secondhand
is
online
illustrations
quite
of cousins.
The novels.
That's
are
very
hard to-
interesting too.
It is interesting, yeah.
Yeah, it's worth reading.
I think it's worth read. When I first read it, I was very dismissive, I must say, but that was a long time ago. Reading it again, it's reading between the lines as well. It's actually, it says an awful lot. She managed to get across a lot. She's not quite as vague as Clough is in his autobiography.
But one thing I wanted to mention about it from one of his books, that they had a cave prepared to go and hide in with tins of food and everything,
Yeah.
because they were on Hitler's blacklist, and it was in some cave behind a waterfall, and I can't imagine where that is.
No. Neither can I.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe the tins are still there.
Yeah, I'm sure they would have been on Hitler's blacklist. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Mum, did you want to say a few words?
Nice.
So, shall
Shall
I get
another
another
chair, Marty? I thought I would say a little bit about what she was like as a grandmother. And well, it's a bit embarrassing to see so many people. She was a very good grandmother. She always read us stories because she was always trying out all these stories that she was editing to bring out to publish. And that was a very pleasant. We spent days and weeks and months listening to stories, fairy stories and science fiction, which Mike Pearson Brondanw used to help her edit. And then later on, she used to take us to the British House, me and Anwell. Men and Robin are 10 years younger, so the British House was the British Association for the Advancement of Science. I'd had a meeting in a different university every year, and prominent scientists who she knew lots of would come and would lecture about different things. I remember Martin Wells, who was an octopus expert, who was very interesting. One time we went to stay in Aberdeen with the family of Dick Singh, who was a Nobel Prize winner who invented paper chromatography. Mixtures of liquids would travel through paper at different rates, and so you could analyze things. And he was married to Anne Singh, who was Anne Stephen, who was, I think, a niece, or anyway, closely related to Virginia Woolf.
Right.
And they had a lot of children who we got on with very well, and that was interesting. We had some very nice fish for breakfast. And yeah, she took us camping one time. I wasn't so keen on that. It was less exciting because we didn't go anywhere. It was something closer. But you know, she was a very good grandmother, and I think, as Robin just said to me, better grandmother probably than mother. I don't think she and Susan got on very well. But what was the name of the Prime Minister who came back with a piece of paper and said, "Peace in our time"?
Chamberlain.
Susan said, because she wasn't political really in any way, but she said that there was a huge demonstration against that in Grosvenor Square. It was absolutely full up, and it wasn't reported. But so she was slightly political, but not much. What else? Oh yes, I wanted to say about how towards the end of her life she was a bit worried about dying, and she wrote to me in New Zealand. She didn't quite say, but she implied that that was what was worrying her. And I said, "Oh well, why don't you come to Buddhist meditation course in Nepal?" And she did. She didn't like to come. It was a month long. She didn't like to leave Clough for the whole course, but she came for a fortnight. And I think she was a person who believed that if you can put something into words, it means you can understand it. And so she was intellectualizing a lot of things. But when she was dying, she did a good job of it. I was there with her. But I think that's all I've got to say.
You understand, just mentioned Susan there, that in the security files, there's a report of a letter. A letter was intercepted from the wife of the Russian ambassador to Amabel. And the letter basically said, "Thank you so much for coming round with a jar of honey." And we were so delighted, something with the markings on it, which had been designed by Susan. Now what it was, with two bees holding up the hammer and sickle.
Communist bees.
Communist bees, in worker bees, presumably. Yeah.
Lots of problems there. Měli by polovi cwestiynau, Merfyn?
Yeah, of course.
Does anybody have questions for Merfyn?
Did she have any ties with Sir John Philby, who lived close by?
Well, she probably did, because she knew so many people, but I'm not aware of that. There is another connection to Philby, King Philby, that is, the spy, who was, as you know, was supposed to be running British intelligence, but turned out to be working for the Russians. In that there's a series of very strange photographs of Amabel in the National Portrait Gallery. You'll see them if you go on the web and just put in her name. These photographs come up. One of them is, or a series of them, she's holding a book, which is a Russian book in English. It's the verbatim account of the 1938 show trials. The trial which actually got Bukharin executed and his wife, even though the deal was that Bukharin would sort of confess to these absurd charges, be executed, but his wife would be spared. And in fact, his wife was sent to the Gulag as well. And by then, Stalin had effectively killed the whole of the leadership of the Bolshevik Party. But the interesting thing is that there's another photograph, which is taken by Edith Tudor Hart. Some of you may know the name Tudor Hart. He was quite an influential communist doctor in South Wales, and actually quite an important researcher in terms of general practice and evidence-based medicine and so on, both father and son. They had practices in very deprived areas in South Wales. And Edith married Tudor Hart, the doctor, but she was herself, what was she? She was Austrian, and was a professional photographer, but it's widely believed that she was actually a Russian agent, and that it was her who had turned Philby, that she had recruited Philby to the Soviet cause. Well, the Daily Express claimed that years ago. You know, can you believe anything you read in the Daily Express? I don't know, but
There was another spy who was working with Philby who was revealed later on.
oh yes, a number of them.
And he'd been in charge of the Queen's pictures.
Yeah, yeah.
What was his name?
Blunt.
Blunt.
Anthony
Because
Blunt, yeah.
the people who lived in Coitrinda,
Yeah.
she worked with him for a long time before she knew he was the spy.
Yeah, there was a network. It wasn't just Philby. Philby was the biggest one because he was able to betray everybody. Yeah.
I was just interested, is there anything on her relationship with her parents,
Yeah.
given that she described herself as a class traitor? I mean, what was the reaction within the family?
Her grandmother lived in Castelldreid. I mean, she had been living somewhere in England, but she moved here.
Yeah.
And she was alive till I was 10. And I think they got on fine.
In the end.
Yes. I don't know when, no, in those
In
days.
her autobiography, she
Yes.
says that's when she was young, she didn't get on with her mother. She obviously got on very well with her father. And it must have been a traumatic moment because the idea was that, you know, she was the literary editor of The Spectator, and John was the up and coming political, you know, whiz kid, and he would take over the political side. But it was clear by the mid-20s that these two had moved way off to the left. And if they were going to take over The Spectator, it would suddenly go from being a very conservative journal to being probably a Marxist journal. And and so her father sold it. But she's always got, you know, and she indicates that was a big, you know, that was a huge wrench, because I think they'd sort of grown up thinking that they would be taking over the Spectator, but their politics prevented them from doing that. But she did indicate there is a strange line in her autobiography which says that, you know, how she didn't get on with her mother
No, I don't.
initially.
don't know.
Yeah, look at it again. I don't know. It's here. I've got a note to it. So. Yeah.
Can I just ask if the name of her first novel, Noah's Ark, was really just a reflection of some incarceration of marriage? It was just two people, everything was sort of in twos or going in on a journey. Was that anything? Or did
I wish I thought of that. That sounds very likely to me. Yeah. It's almost certainly is.
How does a security file get released to the public? What's the process?
It's open. It's in the National Archives, and you can access it.
Is this after the death of
50
someone?
years, isn't it?
After 50 years, yeah.
After 50 years.
You can access your own.
Before 50 years.
Yeah, but it's
Interesting.
it's no guarantee.
You should have a look at yours, man.
I should have a look at mine.
I know.
Yeah. But I haven't yet. No curiosity will lead you there one day. But no, they on the whole they were pretty sensible actually. And there's a book just recently come out which I haven't read, but I read the news of it, which is about the way in which basically the security services in the interwar period they were looking at virtually every creative intellectual in Britain. They were keeping tabs on virtually all writers, really. So maybe Amabel wasn't particularly exceptional. But I should stress that time after time, Clough's name gets bracketed with hers. They don't see much difference. They're both seen as basically left-wing activists and intellectuals. Yeah.
Two things. Where did Clough and Amabel meet? And the other thing is, did they come across? They must have Lloyd George living so local.
Yeah.
I mean, what was their relationship with him?
Well, yeah, they knew Lloyd George. How the story of how they get to meet each other was during the war. Clough was in the Welsh Guards, but he was, very active architect. Was it before the war, maybe? But anyway,
It was before
1915 they got married.
Married during the war.
They married during the war, so it was before the war. It was a competition to build sort of cottages for rural labourers. I think I'm right, Richard. Am I? Yeah. And Clough was involved in this competition and met Amabel, who's the daughter.
Well, he was giving a lecture about, perhaps he won a competition about what he was proposing to do.
Maybe.
And she was sitting in the front row looking absolutely fascinating, beautiful with her wavy red hair. But actually she was watching a mouse under the stairs.
One of the things they do, the security services, when they went to Gibraltar that time, they did give a description of both of them. So Clough was 6'1.5", and she was 5'6", chestnut hair and grey eyes, I think, and so they do give the colour of hair, colour of eyes, and all of that.
Well, her hair was red.
Yeah.
She was very young then.
Yeah.
It wasn't red when I first knew her. It was kind of brownish.
Yeah.
It had been red.
Yeah. So well, maybe the security services may well have got that wrong.
She dyed it so she could go up incognito.
Yeah, sorry, at the back, Nick.
It's been really interesting hearing what you said, particularly I found at the beginning
because one knows a certain amount of people. I've known lots of people that knew Amabel better than I've met her a few times, but it seems to me that her whole life was a series of tensions between opposites. But I think the sexual one is absolutely fascinating because it comes so early on, to have a woman who has a sort of open idea about her own sexuality and sex outside of marriage. And I've never read anything to suggest that they had an open marriage, because there's nothing to suggest that Clough was doing
said
this.
something to me about having affairs was fine.
Yes, yeah, indeed. And
As long as Clough didn't know about it, he didn't want to know anyway.
but it's so, I mean, it's so radical, isn't it?
Yeah.
That is at the heart, and that thing you were saying about the phallic law. I
Yeah.
thought here is a woman who is almost appearing to be driven by desires which we're very familiar at seeing in men and their behaviour. And here's a woman who's being really honest about her own desires. And then you've got the same tension between her politics and this sort of class betrayal. So everything is, and then you've got her actual marriage. Now she's always overshadowed by Clough, and yet in many ways she's more interesting and more unusual.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Nick. I go along with that. It's Noah's Ark is for the time it was written, it could have been written in the 1970s, really, including the title. But she was very challenging political woman.
Well, unless there's any other questions.
Thank you very much for your
like to say
comments and questions, and thanks to Lorianne for the comment about Noah's Ark. I shall incorporate that in anything. Yes.
so interesting.
I hope the people on Zoom. They stop your recorder, right?